Hullabaloo and howdy do, everybody.
Hullabaloo and howdy do.
I'm Jenny from the block, and, yep. We're back to Mr. Beauregard again. For those of you cocking your heads and saying, again? I don't see any other Aron Beauregard reviews on this channel. I actually did, two others? Yeah, 2 others. Yellow and Wedding Day Massacre on my main channel, because that's where I used to do book reviews, and now I do them here. I've also read and not reviewed Playground, The Slob, and Son of the Slob. So I am rather familiar with Beauregardian works of extreme horror at the moment. And all I could do upon cracking open this book was pray that he would spare me from any descriptions of bodily waste, because that one scene in Playground still to this day makes me want to gag. But anyway, I got me a copy of the Handyman, and I figured I would analyze it and compare it to the rest of his work. So, on to the recap. So we have 3 separate major perspectives. We have Blanche, who, with her brother, Alfred, sacrificed their uncle for the sake of some demonic powers when they were kids in 1939. Then we have Sarah, a nurse who's recovering after her son died in a farm accident and her ex-husband yeeted himself from existence, if you get what I mean, from the grief and the guilt. And Vinny, a construction worker and family man in 1996. Vinny's POV is also featured in the 1960s during his childhood. Vinny's story is that his father was a serial killer of women so that he could build a... How do I describe this most accurately? A meat car. It's a flesh car covered in dead women's body parts and flies and maggots. The seats are covered in human skin. I think some of the physical components of the car were described as being made of bone. The headrests have actual human scalps on them. This is, in the most literal sense imaginable, a muscle car. Vinny knew his dad was a killer because he was made to assist in the killings, but he didn't know about the car for a long time. He was also entirely unaware that his long-lost mom was hogtied in the trunk of that literal muscle car, kept alive for 15 years through terrible means because, if I recall correctly, she planned on leaving and Vinny's dad was not having that. So Vinny's pretty messed up, right? He's got necrophiliac tendencies from being exposed to his father's perversions, which included very messed up adult magazines, that he tries to resist. He eventually kills his father in grotesque fashion, grows up, ends up getting a lovely wife named Kelly, who narrowly avoided becoming one of Vinny's dad's victims, and together they have a young daughter named Ashley. He struggles with alcoholism, but gets sober and goes about trying to live a good and clean life. This is difficult, of course, because Vinny's construction company is staffed by guys from a group home. And, I have to tip my hat to Aron Beauregard here because for the first several chapters, I thought these men were simply alcoholics or drug addicts and that Vinny was being judgmental of them because he was reluctant to hire them for jobs. I figured that, having been sober for a year up to this point, he had some, inner complex or shame about struggling with addiction himself and didn't want to associate with addicts as a result. But no, it's a group home for PDFs. Offenders and predators of the sexual variety towards children. At this point, I thought to myself, Mr. Beauregard, I'm gonna need you to come through for me on this one. Please tell me these scumbags are gonna get the Aron Beauregard special. Vinny does not like this, but his boss, Curtis, tells him to shut up and hire the child-enjoying degenerates. Meanwhile, Blanche and Alfred want to do some sort of ritual, so they do some, poop magic? God, Aron Beauregard, why do you do this to me? And Vinny, tired and driving to his in-laws with Kelly and Ashley in the car, crashes after a weird fanged lady appears in the road. He survives, but Kelly and Ashley are unfortunately killed instantly in an extremely gruesome and bloody fashion. Vinny sinks back into alcoholism afterwards, losing his job and being replaced by a smug PDF, nearly yeeting himself from existence before a serendipitous call from Sarah interrupts him. The two meet up, Sarah shares her own loss and trauma with him, and Vinny starts to take a turn for the better. Then Alfred calls, offering Vinny a very special job. Long story short, Alfred and Blanche use a demonic metronome to take control of Vinny, who is forced to yank out all his teeth and replace them with nails. He is then forced to work on their magnum opus, a house of flesh comprised of human bodies, to feed a nexus from which they'll develop powers with which they will overthrow Satan. Gotta tell you, this is the craziest episode of Extreme Makeover Home Edition I've ever watched on an urgent care office's waiting room TV. Boy howdy, did they just happen to snag the right guy for the job. I mean, realistically, how many people do you think have any form of experience with flesh-covered objects? They really did hit the jackpot with Vinny. It was their pet, demon? Badger? Wolverine? I think it was described as a Wolverine. It's a shapeshifter, and it was, him, Herman, that jumped into the path of Vinny's car and consequently killed his wife and daughter. Anyway, their previous handyman, Willis, is all used up, so they kill him and tell Vinny to use his flesh for their toilet. And this is when we learn that actually becoming part of the Flesh House means that you're sort of in a between place between life and death, so Willis starts giving Vinny the skinny on how to stop the siblings. Afterwards, oh, this is what I was waiting for. I knew you wouldn't disappoint me here, Mr. Beauregard. Vinny is sent to go get more bodies, which means he, gets to head off to the construction site where his asshole boss and all those PDF workers are. And boy howdy does Vinny deliver unto them a mighty reckoning. Meanwhile, Blanche and Alfred become aware that Willis has talked to Vinny and decide to dig up poor dead Ashley and add her to the Flesh House with an absolutely horrifying threat that Herman will do very bad things to her if Vinny doesn't cooperate. I think you catch my drift here. Oh, I did not like that part. So Vinny goes and gets more bodies, this time from the PDF halfway house that his work crews come from. I knew you'd come through for me, Mr. Beauregard. I have yet to read a work of yours where a PDF is permitted to live, and that satisfies me deeply. Then Sarah shows up at the mansion because she found a sticky note in Vinny's house with the address. She gets held hostage by the siblings. Vinny has a whole emotional breakthrough after finding a note from his mother saying she loved and forgave him despite participating in the flesh car, and he breaks free of the siblings' influence. He saves Sarah and Ashley, who still, dies, but she's at least not part of the Extreme Makeover Flesh Hell House edition anymore. Vinny gets dentures, hooks up with Sarah, and though he absolutely refuses to do any construction projects now for extremely obvious reasons I don't think I have to explain, the two are very happy. The end. Okay, so, first, I was rather touched by the dedication at the beginning of the book. Quote, "To the many overlooked men who have built, fixed, and continue to develop this impossible infrastructure that everyone in the United States of America has the pleasure of using." Unquote. That was nice. Construction workers and all associated professions work dangerous jobs that wear down their bodies, often in shit weather conditions, and are responsible for making the things that we use every single day, and yet still often get negatively stereotyped in American media because apparently classist stereotypes are fine so long as you think they're justified. I'll get off my soapbox. Anyway, W for Aron Beauregard on that dedication. Construction workers don't get enough praise for the work they do. And then, at the very end of the book, there's a note saying that Handyman was written with the big screen in mind and gives info for anyone interested in adapting it. That was a rather fascinating addition because in some respects I actually feel like this might have been one of the tamer Aron Beauregard books that I've read of his. Much of the first half was surprisingly light on blood, gore, and other disturbing content. There were stretches of time where things really weren't all that extreme. It lingers beneath the surface, pops its head above the waves from time to time, but wasn't saturated with it the way his previous books, at least the ones that I've read, have been. That being said, Aron, buddy, if you want this to be adapted, hit up whoever did The Human Centipede, or Terrifier, because I feel like Handyman is still a bit too extreme for most mainstream horror directors. And also a lot of the indie ones, too. Anyway, there was clearly more effort put into developing the story in this book. It wasn't like Playground and Wedding Day Massacre, where we have loads of characters that are basically just cannon fodder to be murdered in a variety of fucked up ways. I would argue that this was a little closer to The Slob and Son of the Slob in the sense that it actually feels like a story and not just ping-ponging between moments of sheer degeneracy. There's an actual plot that the degeneracy served to drive forward, mostly. Don't think it served the plot so much to show me a scene where Alfred and Blanche state their intention to shaboing boing Herman, their mutant demon monster Wolverine, but I suppose that is Aron Beauregard's prerogative to include in the story. At least it wasn't as disturbingly graphic as Geraldine's exploits in Playground. That still remains as one of the only books that's nearly made me puke. The author has the power to inflict untold damage onto my psyche, and I'm grateful that this time I got something a little less crippling. In any case, overall the plot was better developed than in previous books. Part of that development was Vinny's background. His history with his father and how he was raised and what he's been exposed to influences his behavior throughout the plot, and his eventual emotional breakthrough regarding his mother is eventually what gives him the power to break free from not only the siblings' influence, but also to overcome his dark past, including his sexual inclinations towards badly mutilated women and the recently, or not so recently, departed. Kinda questioning the psychology behind self-acceptance magically banishing what's generally accepted to be a chronic sexual deviancy, considered to be on par with being a PDF, but whatever. This is extreme horror and I don't expect sterling logic or a Psych 101 lesson. Sarah was nice enough, not very deeply developed, but again, this is more Vinny's story and focused on his personal growth and emotional development, so I didn't really expect a super deep dive into her. We knew what we needed to know for the story to keep chugging along, namely to get a sense for why it is that she feels so compelled to help Vinny out of his slump after his wife and daughter die. Alfred and Blanche were developed just enough to be interesting, and they mostly just served to be the degenerate nightmare villains of the story. Familiar Aron Beauregardian-esque villains. I knew there was going to be some sort of mass slaughter just from the inclusion of multiple PDFs. It's that same vibe you get when you're watching a horror movie and they include some really big jerk who you know is going to be one of the first ones to get knocked off, or they're gonna bite it in the most goriest way possible. You know, they're the cannon fodder characters, and never am I more delighted to realize that when they happen to be degenerate child enjoyers. 10 out of 10 would read about these freak-ass monsters getting shredded again. The horror was... how do I put this? We get a taste of the horror at the beginning when Alfred and Blanche murder their uncle. The next real bit of horror comes from when Vinny starts flashing back to his father being a serial killer, and you can sense that the book is building up to something big, or at least I could, since I've read this author before and know that subtlety isn't really his style. But it isn't really until Vinny becomes the siblings' mind slaves that the true horror and tension of the story comes out. As before, much of this book was brief moments of blood and gore and disturbing content, sandwiched between actual storytelling, which is interesting because, you know, it's usually the opposite for Aron Beauregard's books. I occasionally forget during these videos to ask the splatterpunk question, that being, does this extreme horror book also qualify as splatterpunk? Oftentimes the two terms are used interchangeably, but the distinction I tend to make is that splatterpunk is extreme horror, but not all extreme horror is splatterpunk. Splatterpunk tends to be deliberately focused on countercultural themes, whereas regular extreme horror is just extreme for the sake of being extreme. Of course, you could argue that extreme horror is inherently countercultural because of its extreme depictions of sex, violence, and taboo topics, because it goes against what's considered appropriate to depict in most fiction. You can make that argument. Aron Beauregard typically, by my reckoning, tends to be on the more extreme horror side of the spectrum than the splatterpunk side, but sometimes those splatterpunk, anti-authoritarian, and countercultural things get slipped into certain books. I would argue Handyman is definitely more just extreme horror. I didn't catch any particularly countercultural messages in this one. It's a fairly straightforward story of bad people doing bad things to good people, and it's pretty uncontroversial as far as the messaging goes. So yeah, I was surprisingly not traumatized by this one. Quite the unexpected experience given my past with this author's work. I'd actually say this might be a decent extreme horror book for those who are looking to get into the genre, but maybe don't want to go too dark and too deep too quickly. You've got a lot of story buffering in this one to kind of cushion you between extreme horror experiences, so you might like this one if you're just trying out extreme horror. Alright, well I'm sure I'll be dipping back into Mr. Beauregard's work at some point in the future, but for now, I'm out! Have a good night! And thanks for watching!